There it is, the Polar Vantage V3, and in this video today, I want to share with you my experience with this watch so far, the good and the bad, because there's a couple of things I don't love about it. I've had the Polar Vantage V3 for a little over a week now, which is not a ton of time, but it has been enough time to test out a lot of the features of this watch and learn a lot about it, and what I've learned so far has been pretty interesting, so I did want to share it with you today. Oh yeah, and I also wanted to mention that this video is not sponsored in any way by Polar or anybody else. I bought this watch with my own money, so I'll be trying to give you my honest and unbiased opinion as best I can. Moving right along, let's dive into pricing and options. This watch comes in at $599 here in the USA. There's only one version available, but it does come in 3 different colors. That $599 price point is sort of where the struggle begins with the Vantage V3 because that is a really competitive price point. There's a lot of devices for $600 that get you a lot of features, including something like the Garmin Forerunner 965 I have here, which is the exact same price as the Vantage V3 and gives you a lot of functionality and objectively more features than the Vantage V3 at the same price point. But we'll talk about that more later on in this video. With the pricing out of the way, let's dive right into the hardware, the design, the buttons, all that fun stuff. So first of all, this watch is 47 millimeters in diameter, and it's about 14.5 millimeters thick, and it comes in at a really light weight. It's only 57 grams with the included band attached. And for a quick size comparison, I've got some other devices on the table here. All the way on the left, we've got the Apple Watch Ultra 2, then we have the Garmin Forerunner 965, the new Vantage V3, obviously, the Polar Grit X Pro, and finally the big chunky Garmin Tactix 7 Pro, which is a 51 millimeter case size, and obviously the biggest one on the table. And for reference, I do have 165 millimeter circumference wrists. If you're interested in what it looks like on my wrist, there you go. When it comes to build quality, this watch does feel really well built. Even though it's a light watch, so it doesn't have a lot of heft in your hand, you can tell that it's made with premium materials. Most of the case on this, including the bezel and the side of the watch and the case of the watch here, is all made out of aluminum, where the back of the watch is made out of plastic, but the majority is metal, which is nice to see. When it comes to interacting with the Vantage V3, it's pretty similar to older Polar watches. It's got the standard 5-button layout. You've got 3 on the right, 2 on the left, just like on the Grit X Pro here, 3 on the right, 2 on the left. When it comes to the actual buttons, you can see here they're sort of pill-shaped, and they do have a nice grippy texture. It's like a knurled texture to them. When it comes to the included band on the Vantage V3, as you can see, it is a standard quick release band. So I can pop these pins out with my fingernail and remove the band very easily, just like that, and swap it out with any other material or color that I want. It feels a lot like the band that was included with the Grit X Pro, similar material. However, it is a little bit more stretchy, which I do appreciate, so you can get a better fit on your wrist, and it is pretty comfortable. The nice thing about the Vantage V3 is that they do include 2 bands in the box. There's a medium large, which is the one I have here, and a smaller one if you have smaller wrists. Hey there, quick interruption. If you're finding this video fun or helpful, I would really appreciate it if you went down and gave me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel down below so you don't miss more videos from me in the future. Also, if you're planning on picking up anything I show in this video, including the Polar Vantage V3, check out the links down below because they do help support this channel, and they cost nothing extra to use, so you might as well use them. Okay, back to the video. With the band out of the way, let's flip the watch over and take a look at some other details, including the charger. As you can see here, this is the same charger that was used on the Polar Pacer and Pacer Pro. It's a little magnetic charger that sticks on the back there. It works fine. And on the other end of that cable, we do have a USB Type-C connector, which is nice to see. Next to the charging port, you're gonna notice the brand new heart rate sensor using Polar's new Elixir technology. Polar's Elixir technology basically means it's got a whole bunch of sensors built right into that optical heart rate sensor. So on top of the obvious, the optical heart rate sensor, where you can see those green lights there, there's also an SpO2 or blood oxygen saturation sensor in there, which is a first for Polar, so that's good to see. And on top of that, there is an ECG sensor in there as well, or electrocardiogram. And finally, there's a new skin temperature sensor in there as well to detect the temperature of the surface of your skin. And we'll talk more on that in a little bit. Let's flip the watch back over and take a look at the star of the show here, and probably why you're interested in upgrading to this watch, the big, bright AMOLED touch-enabled display. The Polar Vantage V3 features a 1.39-inch AMOLED display with 454 by 454 resolution, which is the highest resolution screen they've ever made. made. This display gets up to 1000 nits of brightness, which is plenty bright for just about any situation, including going for a run in direct sunlight. I've had no issues with visibility in just about any lighting condition. The display on the Polar Vantage V3 also has 3 brightness settings, so there's a high, medium, and low to choose from. Now, of course, this is an AMOLED display, and because of that, this is not a true always-on display like you'd find on the previous model, like the Grit X Pro here, where this is an MIP display that never turns off. The Vantage V3 will dim down, so right now I do have it in its always-on display mode, and if you look closely, you can see the time of day, and to wake it up, you simply have to raise your wrist, and then the gesture will kick in, and it will illuminate the display to its full brightness. The only issue I do have with this watch is the timeout. So if you've noticed, when the display turns on, it turns off very quickly. I'm talking about like 5 seconds, and then it starts to dim down and turn back off. And I've noticed it's even worse when I'm out on an activity like doing a run and I have the map page up. The map seems to turn off within a matter of a few seconds, which is a little bit frustrating. Unfortunately, there is no screen timeout setting in the settings of the watch, so you can't really tweak this. It basically is what it is out of the box. Another thing missing on this display is that there's no palm off gesture. So in a lot of the competition, if you look at your watch and then put your palm on it, you can actually turn off the display to save some battery life, or just turn it off if you don't want a bright thing on your wrist. With this watch, you can't do that. If I palm it, nothing happens. You just have to wait for it to time out. This display does have one more party trick though, and it's that it does have a flashlight now. So if I swipe down from the top of the screen and go over here, I can tap on the flashlight icon. And as you can see, the screen goes to max brightness and turns fully white, which is very useful. And it is really bright. So if you're in a dark room, you can definitely use this to get around or find your keys in your car or something like that. Over the top of that AMOLED display is a Gorilla Glass lens. And as you can see, it's got a sort of curved edge to it, and it is proud of the bezel. I see this sort of glass on a lot of watches, including the Garmin Forerunner 965 I'm wearing right now, as you can see here. And unfortunately, that means if you bump this watch on any surface, the first thing to make contact will be the glass, which isn't great. So if you don't like scratches, I might suggest putting a screen protector on this. And because the glass is curved, that makes things kind of difficult, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Let's dive right into the user interface and the user experience. And a big new feature on the Polar Vantage V3 is that it has a new processor, a new CPU under the hood. Polar claims that it's 129% faster than their previous models, and I would agree with that. This watch is very responsive if you're just swiping around the user interface. It's still not quite the same as something like an Apple Watch or something like that, but for a fitness-focused watch, it's pretty good. The user interface on the Polar Vantage V3 is very similar to previous Polar watches, which is sort of unfortunate in my opinion. I was hoping they'd overhaul it completely and make it look a little bit more modern, but it is what it is. So the way this works on Polar watches is basically if you swipe left or right from the home screen or the watch face, you'll start to cycle through the widgets. So as you can see here, the first widget is my activity for the day. Then we've got the activity for the week. So this would be runs or rides. If I swipe to the right again, we have my nightly recharge, which is part of the sleep data. And of course, if I want more information in any of these widgets, including the sleep widgets, I can simply tap on them to dive further to get more information. For example, here, we're looking at my sleep charge where it shows me I have a score of 89. And if I scroll down, it shows me more details about my sleep. If I swipe over again, we'll go into a new widget called Boost from Sleep, rated on a 1 to 10 scale. The idea behind the Boost from Sleep widget is basically to give you one number to compare from previous days to give you an idea of how much you benefited from that previous night of sleep. Swiping over again, we go to a new widget for the skin temperature. I mentioned before there's a new skin temperature sensor on the back of the watch, and this is the corresponding widget. From what I understand, they basically just record your skin temperature throughout every day to create a baseline. And then from that baseline, they'll let you know on a daily basis if you've gone up or down from that baseline, if your body's gotten warmer or cooler on a given day. Other devices on the market, like the Oura Ring that I'm wearing right now, will actually use this data for things like women's menstrual tracking. That isn't what Polar is doing here. They're basically just collecting the data and allowing you to view it and make up your own kind of decisions on what to do with that. With skin temperature out of the way, let's move right along into the next metric, and that is training load pro. As you can see here, we do have a form of training load on the Vantage V3, and to be honest, this is identical as compared to the older Vantage V2 and even the Polar Grit X Pro. Training load pro gives you an idea if you're overreaching, you're not doing enough, or you're right in that sweet spot when you're doing your training by analyzing realizing how much strain and recovery is going on throughout your training cycle. Moving right along, let's swipe along to the next one, which is suggested workouts, or FitSpark is the title for this widget. And this will suggest workouts that will complement recent activities. So for example, a couple of days ago, I went on a 10-mile run. So it's telling me to do a recovery session here. And if I tap in on that, it'll give me a few options in different recovery workouts. Again, a very useful feature if you're sort of a beginner and you don't have a training plan. You can follow this loosely and probably make a lot of headway. Moving right along to the next widget is the navigation widget, which I found to be very odd because looking at it, it looks like a map. Like you would expect this to be an actual map given that this watch has offline mapping, but it's not. All it is a way to access a compass and your elevation data to let you know your current elevation. But that's all this widget does. To access the maps, you have to do something else, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Swiping over again, we have a sunrise and sunset widget, which is always handy. Then we have the weather forecast widget, which I've already shown you. It's a great widget. Swiping over again, we have our music controls. So as you can see here, I can play and pause and skip ahead tracks or back tracks from the music on my phone for my watch, which is very useful. I was hoping to... You can hear me talking out of my pocket because that is my own podcast. Hey, check out my podcast. Links down below. Keep in mind, these are only music controls for your phone. This is not offline music storage. You can't put MP3s on this watch or sync your Spotify playlist. It doesn't do any of that. Despite having storage for maps, they're not utilizing it for music purposes. Now that we've talked about the user interface, I want to talk about some of the quirks and reliability issues I've spotted while using this watch. I have some concerns with reliability. Let me give you a couple of examples because on about 3 occasions, this watch just decided to reboot itself. It basically crashed and had to start over. So the first time this happened, I was actually sleeping, and in the middle of the night, for whatever reason, the Polar Vantage V3 decided to get like 1,000 of my recent phone notifications and start buzzing and vibrating like crazy, and it actually woke me up because of all the vibration. So when I woke up and looked at my watch, it started popping up with all of these notifications that I had already received the previous day. And it got so many and was vibrating so much that ultimately it ended up crashing. Now that restart doesn't sound like a huge deal, but it was kind of weird, and it ended up erasing all of my sleep data for that night of sleep. But even more annoying than that situation was another situation when I was out on a run. So I was tracking a GPS activity with the Vantage V3, and I was actively looking at the map. So I was using the map page, I was panning around and zooming in and things like that just to test it out. And while I was doing that, the watch just randomly restarted itself and erased my entire activity. So all of the running I had done up until that point, which thankfully was only a couple of miles, it wasn't a big deal, was gone. But I can imagine a lot of situations where this would be a bigger deal. What's really strange about this is that the user interface does feel very stable. There's no lag, it's very responsive, but these crashes do occur randomly. And I've only had the watch for a little over a week, but this has happened 3 times so far. I'm not really sure how to feel on this. This might just be early adopter issues. This watch just came out, just hit the market, but I would have hoped that they would have worked all this stuff out in beta before the primetime full production release. But here we are. With all of that out of the way, let's talk about the new ECG functionality in the Vantage V3 because that is pretty cool. So if I dive into the test feature here, as you can see, we have the same test that you've seen before on like the Polar Grid X Pro and the Vantage V2, including the Orthostatic Test. But if I scroll down, you'll see that there's a new SpO2 test for the blood oxygen saturation sensor and a new ECG test. The way this new ECG test works is if I tap on it, it'll say measure now, and now it'll ask me to put my finger on the top left button. And with my finger on the top left button there, you can see that it's now recording the ECG track, the little red line there, indicating my heart rate. And of course, you want to try to stay as still as possible while you're doing this test, and ideally not while you're recording a YouTube video, but here I am. So at the end of the test, as you can see here, you will get results from your test. So it'll show your average heart rate, which is 73, your heart rate variability, which is 52 right now, and your beat to beat interval. And all this data is synced over to the Polar Flow app on your phone and on their website, where you can actually download a PDF of that actual ECG test to give to your doctor if you want to do that. What's odd about the ECG functionality on this watch though, is that they're not using it to detect AFib like you'd find on something like the Apple Watch Ultra 2 or even a Garmin watch. They're not doing that here because this is not FDA approved, while all of their competitors are. I don't know if they're planning to seek FDA approval down the road. I guess time will tell, but for now, it's a basic ECG functionality where you can record it and view the data after the fact. Another side benefit to that ECG functionality is that you can now do other tests like the orthostatic test here without actually using a chest band. Thanks to its ECG functionality, you don't have to have have a third-party sensor to achieve the results of the test, which is kind of nice. Moving right along, let's talk about activity profiles going for a run or a ride with this watch. So if I dive into the training section here, you can see that the interface is basically the same as all of the previous generations of Polar watches. They have not changed this interface at all in a very long time, and I really wish they would because it's starting to feel a little bit dated. And just like any Polar watch, this watch has an absolute ton of activity profiles, everything from running to cycling to indoor to outdoor, and even things like multi-sport mode for triathlon, for swim, bike, run. And of course, if I tap on the cog icon in the corner here, you have more options for always on display during the activity, power save settings, broadcasting your heart rate over Bluetooth to other devices, training suggestions, favorite workouts, your race pace, kind of like a virtual partner kind of thing, interval timer, countdown timer, routes for navigation, and back to start for navigation, which we'll talk about in a minute. And to start your activity, you simply tap on the red button on the right here, recording started, and you'll go straight into your data pages with all the information that you want to see. And of course, just like on previous Polar watches, all of this information is customizable via the app on your phone. However, you are limited to 4 data fields per page, which I do find to be kind of limiting, especially on a watch like this with a big AMOLED display with tons of resolution. You could probably fit like 8 bits of information here, but they limit you to 4, and I don't really know why. In the final page I want to show you is the map page, because this is a big deal and a good segue into mapping and navigation on the Polar Vantage V3. As you can see, the Polar Vantage V3 is the first Polar watch to get offline mapping and navigation. The way this works is that out of the box, the Polar Vantage V3 will have basic maps for North America and Europe pre-installed on the watch. Now, just because there's only North America and Europe on board doesn't mean you can't get more map regions. In fact, you can actually go to Polar's website where you can download any map from all around the world, and there's 2 options for basic maps or detailed maps. However, the file size isn't really a big deal because you have 32 gigabytes of storage within this watch, and the maps really aren't that big. To swap out maps on this watch, all you have to do is use the supplied USB cable and plug the watch into your computer like the old days, and it will show up as sort of a hard drive to your computer. And from there, all you gotta do is literally delete the maps you don't want or download additional maps from the Polar website and then simply click and drag them over to your watch. There's nothing fancy here. There's no Wi-Fi on this watch. You can't do any of this from the phone app or over the air or anything like that. You need a computer, you need a USB cable to get this done. With all that said, let's talk about the mapping experience, because while it does have offline mapping, there are some quirks about it. First of all, you can only access maps within an activity. Like I just showed you, if you want to see the map, you want to see what's around you or explore somewhere, you need to be in a run or a ride or something like that. You can't just look at the map like you can on some of the other devices out there. And I feel like that's sort of a missed opportunity because they do have that navigation widget where it does show a map, but you can't access the map from the navigation widget, which I find kind of odd. With that aside, the actual detail level of the map is pretty good, and I'll show you some examples on the screen now of me out in the wild actually using this, and I do think the detail is comparable to something like a Suunto or even the Coros maps on some of their newer models. There's a lot of details and shading for waterways and green spaces and things like that. However, there are no labels for roads or trails or anything like that. No points of interest. You're not going to see the summit of a mountain and a label for that telling you what it is. Basically, it's just some context for your surroundings, which is still very useful. The nice thing about this is you can actually pan around using the touchscreen as well by pushing the button on the side there, clicking pan and zoom, and now I can use the up and down to zoom in and out, or I can simply drag around the screen to view other parts of the map here. And the responsiveness while using the map is pretty good. I'd say it's actually a little bit better than the Suunto Race when it comes to refreshing the page. It seems like it's a pretty fast processor in there that's doing the job well. Of course, it's not like using an iPhone. There still is a little bit of lag, but it is very usable. Even though the map detail on the Vantage V3 is pretty good, there are a couple of flaws, and the most major flaw on this watch is that there's no breadcrumb trail when you're using the mapping during an activity. That means if you go out for a run and you're using the map view, it doesn't give you any indication of where you came from. What's really odd about this though is that if you load a pre-made course from Komoot or a GPX file into the watch, that's when you will actually get a breadcrumb trail. You'll see a green line that represents where you should be going and a red line of where you came from. So you'll get it in that situation, and you'll also get it if you do a back to start navigation using the watch. And another flaw with these maps drawbacks is that they're not routable. Like I said before, there's no map labels, which means you can't generate a route directly on the watch like you can on a Garmin. And of course, Garmin's really the only one doing that, like all the competition haven't caught up there, but it is something I would like to see moving forward. With mapping out of the way, let's move into battery life, and this is sort of a can of worms. So the Vantage V3 claims to get about 8 days on a single charge in default settings. That's with the always-on display turned off, and if you do decide to turn the always-on display on, you'll get about 5 days. Now, in my experience with the always-on display turned off, I am getting around 6 to 7 days on a single charge with this watch, which is pretty good because I'm using it to go for runs on a daily basis, and that wasn't included in that 8-day claim, so I think it's bang on there. However, things change quite a bit when you turn the always-on display on. In my limited testing with the always-on display on the Polar Vantage V3 so far, I'm only getting like 2 to 3 days of use before I need to charge the watch, and that's with daily runs included. I don't know what's going on here, but it seems like the battery is draining extremely quick with the always-on display turned on, and I'll need to do more testing to really come up with a conclusion on this, so stay tuned for a follow-up video down the road. With that out of the way, let's talk about GPS on battery life when you're actually out on a run or a ride, because this is pretty impressive as well. With the Vantage V3, you can get up to 53 hours with default settings without the always-on display turned on, and 53 hours is a very long time. That means you could run over 100 miles, do an ultra marathon a couple of days long, go on a weekend camping trip, something like that, and still have plenty of battery life. Now, in my personal testing, I'm seeing a battery burn of about 2 to 3% during an activity, which is somewhat in line with their claim, but it does seem a little bit generous. I do think the battery life is good, but it may not be as good as they're claiming. However, when it comes to recording an activity with the always-on display turned on, that's where the battery life becomes a real issue. And in my testing, I saw a pretty significant drop with the always-on display turned on in a GPS activity, and I'm probably just going to leave the always-on display off when using this watch. If you need even more battery life, there is a power save mode with the Vantage V3 that will give you up to 140 hours in an activity at the expense of some accuracy, so you wouldn't want to use this all the time, but it is there in a pinch. With battery life out of the way, let's dive into GPS modes and GPS accuracy, because the new Vantage V3 is equipped with a brand new multi-band GNSS system. Multi-band or dual band is sort of the gold standard when it comes to position tracking, and we're seeing it on a lot more devices these days, like the Apple Watch Ultra 2 and a lot of the new Garmin watches. And now we've got that here on the Vantage V3 as well. I took the Vantage V3 out on a whole bunch of different runs with my Garmin Forerunner 965 and my iPhone as a baseline of comparison, and generally speaking, it did a pretty decent job. However, these conditions were not super challenging. I didn't have a lot of cloud cover or big buildings around. These are pretty ideal conditions on a sunny day, and in those conditions, I'm seeing pretty good results so far. As you can see, the tracks look pretty solid. However, the Polar Vantage V3 does drift a little bit more than the Garmin Forerunner 965 in some situations. I did find that it would wander off a little bit and then snap back in later on, but generally the tracks look pretty good overall. And when I compared their overall distance at the end of the activity, that was also pretty similar as well. With GPS accuracy out of the way, let's move right into the optical heart rate sensor on the back of the watch and talk about its accuracy, because that is a bit of a different story. Unfortunately, my experience with the heart rate sensor on the back of the Polar Vantage V3 has not been very good, and that's kind of strange because in the past with a lot of Polar watches, I got really good results from all their previous models, and as you can see, the lines just don't add up with the Polar Vantage V3. Generally speaking, the trend line is similar with the other test devices, but here and there you'll notice these big spikes or big drops that just aren't present on the Garmin or on the ECG sensor, and I'm not entirely sure why. And this phenomenon isn't only during one particular run, it's on basically all of my runs, I'm seeing the same thing. There's always a spike or a drop here and there. While the trend line is somewhat in the ballpark of being accurate, there's just these erroneous data points that show up all across the board. To be fair, the data I'm getting isn't like total garbage. Like I said, it's somewhat in the ballpark of being accurate, but all of that erroneous data around it really bothers me, and I feel like they could do better here, and hopefully they can fix that in a firmware update as well. With all of that said, we've gotten to that point in the video where I want to talk final thoughts and conclusions about the Polar Vantage V3, and this is going to be a tough one. The Polar Vantage V3 is a good-looking watch with a lot of interesting wellness and training tools and an excellent display, along with impressive battery life. This watch solves a lot of the problems I had with older Polar watches like the Grid X Pro or the Vantage V2 with their laggy user experience and their dim displays. That's all fixed here. With that said, I've run into reliability issues on this watch, which is critical because the last thing you want during your dream marathon is for your watch to crash at mile 25 and erase all of your data. That is a nightmare. This is something that absolutely needs to be fixed, and I am optimistic that they will fix it in a firmware update down the road, hopefully at least. On top of the reliability, the mapping experience, while it is a nice addition, isn't exactly what I hoped for and is lacking core functionality like breadcrumb tracks, and I also didn't get the best performance from the new heart rate sensor, which is surprising given their reputation as making heart rate sensors. I don't really get that. And finally, I do wish they just spent more time overhauling the user interface, making the whole experience feel a little bit more modern, and maybe even adding some more smartwatch features like offline music or contactless payments or something like that. At the end of the day, I am hopeful that some of these issues can be fixed via software. However, these complaints are amplified by the price tag. At $599, this is not a cheap watch, and when you compare it to something like the Garmin Forerunner 965, which is the exact same price, you get a lot more with this watch. Way more advanced mapping, more smartwatch features, offline music, the list goes on, and a better user interface overall. So let's get to the big question here. Should you buy this watch? Should you spend $600 on the Vantage V3? Probably not right now until they fix things. However, if you are an existing hardcore Polar fan and you've been waiting forever to upgrade your Vantage V2 or Polar Grid X Pro, and you love the Polar Flow app and the web portal and the ecosystem and how it all works, then maybe consider the Vantage V3 if you're comfortable with some of the issues and potential fixes that they're coming out with down the road, I hope. If you're comfortable with all of that, then maybe spend $600 on this watch. If you are not an existing Polar user or a Polar fan at all, and you've got $600 in your pocket and you're not an existing user to any brand, there's better options out there, like the Garmin Forerunner 965 or even the brand new Suunto Race, which has a lot of the same features as the Vantage V3 for $150 less. That watch comes in at $450 and even has a sapphire display, which this watch doesn't have. I think I could summarize this whole video by saying the Polar Vantage V3 has potential to be great, but it's not quite there yet. And now, I want to hear from you. In the comments down below, let me know what you think about the Polar Vantage V3. Are you going to get one? Are you going to skip on this one? Are you going to get a Garmin Forerunner 965 or something else entirely? Let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear from you. And with that, we have reached the end of this video. If you found this video fun, helpful, educational, anything, please consider giving me a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel down below so you don't miss more videos from me in the future. And of course, if you're planning on picking up the Polar Vantage V3, a Garmin 965, an Apple Watch Ultra, or just about anything else, I'll have everything linked in the description down below, and those links do help support this channel, and they cost nothing extra to you, so you might as well use them. And while you're down there, you might as well go check out my website and merch store. You can buy a sweet sticker like that. Make sure to follow me on my podcast and my Instagram page and all the places down there. Would you? Okay. Did I plug everything? Okay. I'm gonna go now. I'll see you later. Bye.